We will now place our extension for the handle on the ratchet. This 14mm bolt will eventually need a combination wrench to help assisting removing it, then it can be removed by hand. When we take a look at the position of the ratchet in relation to removing the lower bolt, you'll notice it's at a 90-degree angle, making its position available between the wheel well. The position of the ratchet handle will be available in this area for you to place your extension for its handle to push up for releasing the nut. Once this bolt is released and removed from the transmission bell housing, then it's possible to, on that very same bracket, you're going to notice two 14mm bolts that's holding it to the side of the engine block, just like the one on the starter side. Those two bolts will also need removal. Here is the position for the ratchet when removing those two bolts. Since the extension for the ratchet handle is being used for removing the 14mm bolt, we will now use the pipe handle for the engine hoist as that ratchet handle extension. This will require both hands for removal. The second bolt, which is located in front of the one that we remove, is going to require you to reach your hand from the front of the engine over the mount, hold the ratchet in position on the extension while your other hand untighten the bolt. Finishing the removal of the bolt will involve your hand, and when you do so, the bracket will most likely come loose. We'll first bring down the bolt, and then we'll bring down the bracket. So you see that's where the two bolts go against the engine block, and this is where the two bolts go against the transmission bell housing. These are the bolts and the two brackets that was removed for freeing the engine block from the transmission bell housing. This is only a partial release of the transmission bell housing from the engine block. So here we see the four short 14mm bolt is for holding the brackets to the engine block. The long ones is for the bell housing, and this one here is for the bell housing and to hold the transmission cooler line support bracket. One last bolt to remove is that 14mm bolt connecting the block to the transmission bell housing. It will require the position of the 14mm wrench to this angle. Then we will have to place another combination wrench on that 14mm wrench to apply leverage for breaking that nut off. Once the bolt has been released sufficient with the combination wrench, then you'll reach up there with your hand and get it out of the way. This bolt connects the transmission block to the transmission aluminum bell housing, so you must be careful when reinstalling it. You do not want to strip the treads. Before the transmission bell housing can be unbolted and detached from the engine, these four 14mm bolts that attach the engine flex plate to the automatic transmission torque converter must be removed. During the installation of this engine video, we will show you how to install these bolts by removing the splash guard plate. Now that we have our bolts removed, I just want to place my hand to the back here so I can make sure that the torque converter is rotating, letting us know that it's free from the flywheel. The transmission cooler line will require detachment from its banjo bolt and lasso or hangman fitting. We also have one here next to the 4x4 shifter lever. We also have two 10mm bolts for removing from the transmission oil pan to free the transmission oil cooler line. Once the 10mm bolt has been released, we will release these retainer clips for the transmission cooler line and replace the 10mm nut for security purpose. Removal of the banjo bolt for the transmission cooler line will require a 18mm combination wrench using the box end for removal. We also have to make sure we secure these washers. These are copper washer, they're compressible, and they also must be replaced when reinstalling the banjo bolt. That is what the banjo bolt looks like. This is the same bolt that is used on the brake caliper of a different size. So a catch can will have to be placed under the transmission for collecting this oil, because you do not want the oil on the floor. This will promote slip and fall. Removal of the banjo bolt on the left side of the transmission for its cooler line will require the wrench to be positioned like this, pushing it up for releasing. Then that same 19mm wrench will be positioned like this for removing the banjo bolt. You will not have a problem with oil dripping from this fitting because it's above the other one. A long 10mm 1/4" drive socket with a flexible handle ratchet will be required to position like this for removal of the transmission cooler line. This will require both hands, one hand to hold the ratchet and the socket in on the fastener, and the other hand for turning the ratchet. With the transmission oil cooler line detached from its attachment, now it will be easier to relocate this line when removing the engine, so this oil sump will not be able to bend the line during lifting of the engine. The next bolt to be removed is this 14mm bolt between the front drive shaft and the transmission oil pan on the left side of the transmission bell housing. This bolt will be removed with a 14mm 6-point socket 1/2" drive. This is the position of the tool when it's installed onto the 14mm bolt for the transmission bell housing. Okay, so this bolt here came out. That's the position where the bolt came out from. This is our extension with the 14mm socket installed on the transmission bell housing bolt to the right side of the transmission. Let's follow this extension so you can see where it makes its exit. Once that 14mm bolt has been removed from the transmission bell housing, you're not going to be able to get to it with your hands. You're going to have to use a magnet like this for fishing it out of the hole, because if you push your hands up in there, you see that rusty bolt, that bracket, that's going to slice your hand, so you don't want to reach your hands up in there. Always want to use the magnet. This is the bolt that was removed. On the left side of the transmission bell housing, this is our last transmission bell housing bolt, where you see the extension of the 14mm is being attached like this. This is the position for your ratchet when you want to get that last bolt all the way up in there on the bell housing. Once that bolt has been removed completely with a ratchet, you will then use this magnet for attracting it and taking it out of the hole. That is the only way for getting this bolt out. Your hands are not going to be able to get up in that area. Behind the engine, between the firewall, are two more bolts. That's one. And the other one is on this side. You're not going to be able to see it, but you're going to be able to feel it with your hand. This bolt here to the left side of the transmission bell housing on the top will require a 14mm wrench, and the wrench has to position like this with this part facing forward. So you're going to have it like that, not like this, always like this. With the 14mm wrench fitted to the bolt, we're now going to use an additional combination wrench for extension and turning that bolt. Alright, so eventually you're going to have to use this wrench back and forth to unscrew that bolt. Then you're going to be able to get at it with your finger and your left hand. That is our bolt. Our second bolt to the right side of the top of the transmission bell housing will require a different tool. We have to use this 14mm 6-point socket 3/8 drive with a ratchet. I have to reach down here once we have our socket installed. Then we will fabricate our extension for the handle. And we simply want to go to the left side of the vehicle or your right side. Let us release our bolt. We'll continue turning the bolt until the ratchet cannot turn it anymore. Remove the ratchet. Gonna reach back here with your hands, your left hands. And remove the bolt. So that is all the bolt for the transmission bell housing and the torque converter with the flywheel. Now we're ready to remove the engine. One last thing we have to remove before we could take this engine out of here is we have to remove the crankshaft position sensor. In the video description link, there will be a video link to show you how to remove this crankshaft position sensor so the engine can be removed, or the crankshaft sensor can be changed in the event it should become malfunction. So you're going to have to be careful when you're working back here because there's a lot of sheet metal that could cut your hands. So this is our crankshaft position sensor. We're just going to leave it here because when we install the engine, it's going to have to go back in. Issue. The Nissan manufacturer did not intend for you to remove this engine because they did not place these hooks anywhere on the engine to connect your chain for installation. So I had to remove those hooks. I had to borrow them from another vehicle. So those two hooks came off of this Toyota 1.6, one from here and one from there. Once the engine has been unbolted from the transmission and all its accessory, you will then be required to remove the 14mm nut from the top of the engine mount. And these two 14mm nuts from the bottom of the engine mount. We will also be required to do the same thing on the right side engine mount. By detaching this 14mm nut and its locking washer from the top of the mount and the bottom of the right side engine mount frame support, where it's cracked, fractured, and broken, will require repair when the engine is removed. Okay, so the tool that we have developed for removing the flywheel nut is the same tool we're going to use for removing these bolts, because it might be nearly difficult to get a ratchet up in there. So you're going to have to use some patience and take your time for removing these engine mount lower bolts. To remove the rear 14mm nut from the lower engine mount, it will require you to position your wrench like this at the back where the axle is, so you can gain access by turning it. So there you see the wrench. You simply reach up in here and you're going to pull it towards you for untightening the nut. With the two nuts from the lower engine mount removed, we will now move to the right side and do the same thing. But before you do so, simply disconnect the tube from here, and when the engine is lifted out, it's going to take the line with it. With the right side engine mount fastener saturated with penetrating lube, we're then going to use this long 14mm socket 3/8 drive for removing these two bolts. With both of the nuts removed, we can now take the engine mount out from under the engine once the engine has been lifted up with its engine hoist. So here's something extra I want to show you. On this idler arm, you will notice on your factory idler arm you do not have this grease nipple, but there will be a 6mm screw or fitting here that you can remove and install the appropriate grease nipple for greasing the idler arm. It's not only that this mount is separated from its rubber insulator, it's also broken, the metal, from its support. The most important part for lifting out the engine is making sure you can rent or buy an engine hoist like this Then we will position that engine hoist onto our chain for removal of the engine mount and the engine from its compartment. Removal of the engine is going to require balancing its looping chain onto the hook. Sometime you're going to have to move the hook to the back of the chain or the front of the chain to balance the engine so it does not tilt or roll over when it's being removed. Now it will require you for the up and down pumping action of the hydraulic ram to lift its boom for engine removal. So what we want to do here, we just want to lift this engine up as much as we can. So this is going to be the limit for lifting the engine, because most likely it will jam up on the firewall transmission tunnel, but it should give us enough room for removing the engine mount. Based upon lifting the engine, we could see its bracket is now off the engine mount for engine mount removal without the engine. Okay, so we can already see here that this engine mount is damaged, totally separated. This is going to have to get replaced with a new factory Nissan engine mount. Alright, now that we have removed one side of the engine mount, we cannot let this engine sit back down on the chassis because you might dent the oil pan and damage other parts. Let's go to the other side and see what's going on. With the engine mount removed from the left side, we can see on the right side it's not the same thing because the engine mount top flange is still seated onto the engine mount. Alright, so this is the mount for removal, totally destroyed. Have to get new ones. Now we're going to lower the engine below where it was seated on the mount so we could detach the transmission bell housing from the engine for removal. It's time to lower the boom for the engine hoist, which will require releasing of this valve by turning it counterclockwise. This blue harness plug is also going to need unclipping from that bracket right there. You see that's the wire. This goes down to the transmission, so this will have to leave the engine while it's being removed. This is what we want to achieve. See, that's the wire going to the transmission. So we're just gonna secure this up here. Don't want the engine to tug on this wire. This vacuum line for the EGR system will require removal because we don't want the chain to damage it. During the process of removing the engine, you want to make sure you never place your hand on the distributor for maneuvering the engine because this will break the distributor cap and its housing. Once the engine is suspended on its engine hoist, then you can take your hand like this and try to rock the engine out of its transmission bell housing. If it does not come apart, then you're going to have to check your bolts and fasteners to see if anything is holding the engine back from removal. So most of the time the exhaust manifold downpipe is what's going to hold you back. You're going to have to maneuver it to free the exhaust manifold so the engine can shift forward like this. See, now we have the engine detached from the transmission bell housing. But we still have to check that transmission oil cooler line to make sure that it does not become ruptured when we're moving the engine out of its compartment. You can see we have maneuvered the transmission line to clear the oil pan sump, and when we look up in between the transmission bell housing and the rear of the engine, we could see we have a complete separation, which is a sign that all the bolts has been removed from the transmission bell housing to the engine. With the hood removed, now we could completely lift the engine out of its compartment.
You lift down with it,
Can't talk, the camera's recording. Here, you come down. Before someone do this. Okay, we're complete with our engine removal. Okay, let's take a look at this. This is the transmission bell housing dust cover that could be removed. For gaining access to the transmission torque converter bolt. So we do not need a special tool for getting to these bolts. Removal for this additional splash guard is going to require detachment from these dowel pins. You're going to have to just play with the metal so it could slide off the pin. You have one over here and one here. You will most likely need a flat screwdriver to place between the plate and the engine block, trying to prying it off the dowel pin